Hello everyone and welcome back to the next video in the vocal analysis series. We are going to be taking a look at Shu today, and I have had a lot of requests ever since I started this project. Not necessarily for Shu specifically, but for Valkyrie, so I figured it was finally time I tackled one of them. Since there's only two, I was waiting on it a little bit, but considering that Valkyrie, at least for me, has one of the strongest discographies in the game, I am more than happy to talk about them. That being said, once again, I'm going to predict this might be a little bit of a shorter video just because I don't really have a big introduction. There's not a whole lot to say in terms of Valkyrie as a unit because I feel like the general consensus is that they work really well together and there's not much else to talk about that we won't get into while listening to the actual songs. In terms of Shu's voice actor, I don't actually have any comparison songs to play. There are ones that exist, and he has a lot of his own personal music projects, but a lot of the voice work he's done just hasn't been for characters that sing. He's obviously voiced quite a few notable characters in Shonen series, and a few in Josemuke series as well. Like, he's in Idolish 7, he's in Mahoyaku, he's in Touken Ranbu, which I have to mention for the sake of being thorough, but he has not sung in any of those for the characters that he voices. And going way back, I guess I could have, thrown in Japan from Hetalia if I really wanted to, but those songs exist if you want to go listen to them. It's an interesting comparison, but not really the same kind of thing we're talking about here. And one of the things I noticed while kind of going through and collecting all of these vocal clips is that speaking just about the vocals in Valkyrie songs is kind of difficult because Valkyrie's entire MO is like performance art. It's everything put together. It's not just the vocals, it's the songs, it's the musical style, it's the way they set up their stages, and it's the melding of all of those things that kind of create the effect that is Valkyrie, and that's completely intentional. But that isn't to say that the singing isn't impressive, because it kind of has to be for the type of music that they're doing, and the fact that a lot of their songs are very classically inspired, they're very musically complex in a lot of ways. So the singing is certainly one part of that, but it's not the whole picture, whereas some other units, the musical soundscape kind of takes a backseat to the performers themselves. Valkyrie is all part of one package. And when talking specifically about Shu's voice and the voice that Hiroki is using for Shu, one of the things I noticed, again, this is kind of my initial impression before going through and listening to everything really carefully, is that a lot of the dramatic aspect of Shu's voice comes from Hiroki playing around with his tone as opposed to things like range or pitch changes or even stylistic ways that he's singing. For instance, and again, we'll get into this more as we listen to the individual examples, but Shu rarely, if ever, goes into head voice. He does at least give the illusion of belting a lot, even if it's not technically considered belting, but at the very least, he plays around a lot with his dynamics, but that never really extends into what I would call a true head voice, and especially not a true falsetto. But because he can inject so much emotion into his voice, regardless of what part of his tone he's using, I feel like you don't really think about that particular aspect of it a whole lot unless you're really focusing in on the notes themselves. And I've heard some people describe Valkyrie singing, especially when they're singing together, in that Mika is kind of there to support Shu. Which in some ways is true because Mika's voice can be far more neutral than Shu's and far easier to blend. Like, if Shu was singing, you know that Shu was singing. There was no way to hide his voice. Whereas Mika's voice, just because it kind of has a more even tone, can be used to prop up Shu's singing. But on the other hand, if there's ever any sort of big moment, any sort of high notes, any sort of really technical singing that has to be done, Mika's always the one that takes those parts. So I feel like that's also one of the reasons that Valkyrie works so well together, because there is this push and pull between them, and obviously that's the entire point of their relationship within the story of On Stars as well, but it does translate into their music quite effectively. I think that's really all I have to say as an introduction, so let's get right into it. So I think I've talked before about how my first event when I downloaded the game and started playing On Stars in earnest was Marionette. So it's almost been exactly 9 years since then, which is kind of wild to think about, but I never knew Ensemble Stars without Valkyrie. So after I downloaded the game and opened it and saw, the Valkyrie introduction screen and everything and saw Mika's character design, I was just kind of like, this one is my son. And he's still my son 9 years later. It is very rare that the character I'm initially drawn to, for whatever reason, be it their appearance or someone telling me, hey, I think you'll like this character, it's very rare that that character remains my favorite over a long period of time. Normally I get into the story and I end up liking characters that I hadn't really considered at the beginning. Mika is still my favorite character in the series, so he's lasted in that sense. But that aside, even though Valkyrie had their first event and were introduced into the game in March of 2016, the album preview for their album I don't believe came out until the fall. It was like October and November. So we all spent, about 6 or 7 months kind of wondering what their music would sound like. Obviously, based on their design and their aesthetic, we kind of had an idea. But I don't think anyone expected their voices, and in particular Mika's voice, to sound the way that it does in the songs. And I remember when the previews first came out, a lot of people had a hard time differentiating them just because Mika's singing voice is so far removed from his speaking voice. Shu's, on the other hand, you can hear the similarities. The drama is still there. And in general, I would say that Shu's voice really hasn't changed that much from the beginning of the game until now. I think they had a pretty good idea going in of what his character was, and obviously his character has evolved, but his flair for the dramatic and his intensity when it comes to performing really hasn't changed that much. And the one thing about Shu's singing voice that has always struck me is just how much feeling he puts into almost everything he does. Like, this man does not know how to sing neutral, and because of the type of music that Valkyrie makes, it works really well. But his tone fluctuates so much, even within singular lines of music. Like, there are times his bass tone is actually very clean, and when he's singing softer or when he's singing slower songs, you can hear that. But he injects so much of this growl, almost this snarl into his singing, to the point where sometimes it almost sounds like he's just cutting the words off so abruptly. It's almost like he's singing through clenched teeth, which obviously he isn't. Like, I've watched Hiroki do lives, and I would once again recommend, if you have never seen Valkyrie perform live, please do. Like pretty much all of the units in OnStars, they're great. The difference between watching Hiroki as Shu, the character, and then just kind of seeing him when he's not necessarily in character is quite something, so definitely check that out if you haven't. Otherwise, I feel like Miwakugeki is still kind of the Valkyrie song. Like, it's the song you think about when you think of Valkyrie, just because when it came out, it was the only Valkyrie song that existed, because the first album was this one and Saju no Rokak. And obviously that was ex-Valkyrie, so it's not quite the same makeup. And I had debated for a little bit how I was going to structure this video, whether I wanted to throw the ex-Valk songs in the order that the CDs were released, or whether I wanted to leave them till the end. I decided to leave them to the end, so the first part of this is just going to be Shu and Mika as Valkyrie, and then the 2 songs with Nazuna are going to be kind of in the second part of the video. It's just a little bit easier to divide it up that way, and also, just like with the YouTube video, I'm not going to put the name in the upper corner of the screen, because if he's singing with anyone in these first 15 songs, or however many there are, he's singing with Mika, so I didn't think I needed to actually denote that on the screen. I think Arai Sanka does a good job of showing off other parts of his voice. Obviously, it's still very strong, and you can kind of hear that whenever he does go high, it's never into a soft note. It's never into, like I said before, a falsetto, or even what I would call like a traditional head voice. It's almost always a belt. It's just really loud. He pushes through it. But the pre-chorus sections in this song, at least for this video, is the first time you get to hear him sing softer. And you can hear how clean his tone is when he's not adding any of that snarl, that bite to it. He has a very nice melodic tone when he wants to utilize it. You'll also probably notice that he doesn't use a whole lot of vibrato. He can, and he does in certain circumstances. But just like way back in the Adonis video when I talked about Mezzo from Idolish 7, and one of the ways they balance their voices out is that they allow one of them to go heavy on the vibrato and the other one to kind of not use it at all. Valkyrie is kind of a more subdued version of that, because Mika's vibrato is not nearly as pronounced as Tomoki's, but he still tends to use it pretty often, whereas Shu uses it a lot more sparingly, usually because of the dynamic tone of his voice. And in this case, I'm kind of using dynamic to mean two different things. I'm using it that on the one hand, his voice is very changeable and very expressive, but on the other hand, to use the correct definition of dynamics in music, it just means a shift in volume. And we've talked before about how certain characters, when they sustain long notes, instead of letting the note fade away, they push it so the note actually becomes louder, they crescendo. And that's almost what Shu does all the time when he's holding long notes, and you can hear some examples of that in this song.
空踊る花弁は夢追い人たちの屍愛は美しいままなぜうわうつくれ火をさまよう者たち視野の空に集うこぼれ日のもとへ帯の歌が満ちる鳴り響け雪原のラメント
Last Lament is interesting because for a lot of it, especially in the verse parts, the background instrumentals almost completely fade out, so their voices are much more in the forefront. It's not necessarily a slower song in terms of tempo, but there's a softer, more subdued feeling to it. And despite that, he's still kind of using his normal tone even in those sections. So it's a really interesting contrast, again, especially with Mika's voice, because Mika, in this sense, is kind of singing more quote-unquote to meet the music, and Shu is just kind of, he's still using that really snarly, bitey tone that he tends to use more often than not. And one of the other things you'll notice in this one is that when Shu does keep a softer tone when he's hitting higher notes, he ends them very abruptly. And these are all very obviously stylistic choices, probably again, partially to suit his character and also partially to ensure that what he is doing with Mika matches up with each other. And like I alluded to earlier, this is the hard part about doing Valkyrie as a singular vocal analysis, because their music is just so interesting and complex that it really is a disservice to not look at it as an entire package. And that is something I've kind of been considering, doing shorter videos of more general song analysis as opposed to just vocal analysis. That would obviously be part of it, because in this case we're only looking at individual characters and not really how it fits into the song as a whole. But if that's something you'd be interested in, let me know. I'm open to suggestions. Those videos would probably come out more frequently because they would likely be shorter, but you know, we'll see where it goes. And I'll admit that was one of the other reasons I was holding off on doing Valkyrie, because I knew I would eventually end up saying something like that, just because I feel like their music deserves a closer look than at least the parameters of this project allow.
危険をつまびき歌に寄り添う風に嘆く哀切も小さえも失い未来たちは求める希望に届くしるべ手を伸ばすがいい
So despite the fact that Shu always sings with a lot of emotion, this is kind of the first time he's actually used a vocal cry, or at least you can hear it within the music. Generally, his notes are very clean. They have a very definitive start point and end point, and he doesn't really add anything else to move from one note to another, if that makes sense. And once again, Memoir Antique is a little bit softer, a little bit slower. He's still using most of his normal tone, but there are certain sections where, and this actually is really interesting to me from a mixing perspective, because it's not something I've noticed a lot with the mixing in OnStar's music, but there are at least a couple of sections where he goes up technically into a belt, and they just cut the volume on him entirely, so it doesn't sound nearly as loud or out of place as it might sound otherwise. It's especially noticeable in the one chorus. When he does the part at the very end, it's meant to be kind of a bigger moment, but it's an interesting way to kind of be able to maintain the character voice that he's using without it sounding out of place in the music. So I thought I would mention that, at least for this song in particular. He does use a little bit more vibrato in here. He uses that very tight, sharp vibrato a couple of times, but it doesn't happen all the time, and it will happen kind of more as we go along, especially during these solo parts. But when Shu is singing with Mika, he pretty much doesn't use any vibrato at all.
の目がやかましく侵入を知らせる数えてはいけないよ壁に並ぶあのシルエット意識悪夢を召し上がれあれパイでもてなそうかお好みはどれかね僕と席をあげよう
For a long time, this was probably my favorite OnStar's Halloween song. I like most of their Halloween songs for the most part, but this one was definitely my favorite. At this point, Helter Spider might be my favorite, but I still like this one a lot. It kind of gives Shu the opportunity to be at his growliest, if that makes sense. If you listen to his solo parts, he is biting the words. When he sings vowels, he kind of enunciates them in a way that makes them sound very tight. He's not singing open. He's kind of giving this very swoopy effect to almost every note that, again, really plays with the dynamism in his voice and adds to that really dramatic effect that he's putting into it. There is one part in this song where he sounds almost exactly like Mika, but it's only for like half a line, and then he comes right back into sounding like Shu again. So again, thought that was interesting because I think more than anything, it's things like that that prove that Shu's character voice is a very strong character voice. And it's not that Hiroki can't do other things with his voice, but when he sings as Shu, he is so committed to Shu as the character that you can really hear that coming through, and that regardless of what Shu is doing for the most part, he still sounds like Shu. Like I said before, if Shu is singing with somebody, you can always hear him. 落ちる悪夢の雷鳴奪うことなどできる奈落という闇すらも全たる美しさを導かんと歌う譲るゆえに誓うこないしを形容 I think Gaisenka is probably one of my favorite anime ending songs. A lot of these anime ending songs, I like them, but they don't really bring anything new into the discographies of the different units. This song is also interesting because Shu almost gets into what I would call whisper singing at some points, where it's not in the way that we talked about in the Ray video where his voice is getting so low that he kind of has to whisper. It's completely on purpose. The notes are not super low, but he's still injecting a lot of breath behind his tone. And that kind of almost makes the growling more prevalent. And again, those are really the only ways I have to describe Shu's tone. Like, it's so distinctive, but it's very hard to put it into words. Like, Shu's tone to me is a feeling. And it's very easy to tell what he's feeling when he's singing, because he doesn't hide any of it. So now we're into the music era, and I would say overall, as the years have gone on, Valkyrie's music has gotten a little more experimental, but it's still the fundamentals of what make their music so easy to recognize as Valkyrie are definitely still there. And when you have these two-person units, you don't really run into the issue that some of the other ones were facing where it felt like the featured character didn't necessarily get the bulk of the song, because for the most part in Valkyrie songs, the parts are divided fairly evenly, so it always feels like you hear a lot from both of them, and most of these songs I did have to cut down a little bit, so this isn't all of the parts, but it's as much as I could fit in, limiting myself to about 30 seconds. Eternal Weaving being the first event song that Valkyrie got after music came out, I'd say it's probably the most similar to their music from the older era. And in terms of what Shu's doing vocally, you can hear a lot of what we've already talked about, most notably the way that he enunciates his vowels, and he does it a lot here, probably more than he's been doing in other songs. Particularly in this part where it's technically two lines combined, but it kind of shows the same thing in both of them. And then as always at the end, I like to put in some speaking parts when I can, so you can just hear his normal speaking voice. I think the biggest thing with Shu when the original songs came out was that a lot of people thought his singing voice was too expressive, or at least more expressive than his character had kind of shown up to that point. But I think as the years have gone on, and there's actually been more voice stories and more opportunities for Shu to talk, I think it makes perfect sense for his singing voice to sound the way it does.
「 と
This one is interesting to me because overall Shu is singing quote unquote softer, but he's not really changing his tone a whole lot. We've talked about before how he can sing with a very clean, pure, soft tone. In this one, he's still got a bit of that harsh edge to it, but volume-wise he is singing softer, and that kind of automatically tones down the rest of it to make it sound more even than it would otherwise. This one, especially in the choruses, it's hard to kind of isolate the vocals because a lot of the times they're overlapping and singing over each other, but you can hear he has a few sections where he does have really long sustained notes with very minimal vibrato. So he's starting to actually, as opposed to what we talked about earlier when he was typically always pushing through long notes and if anything he crescendoed on them, he's starting to sustain them at a consistent volume, still without adding any vibrato, still without really fading the notes away. It's just kind of one long, very unwavering sound. So I think if anything, as Shu's voice is evolving as time goes on, the biggest difference that you can hear in it is just that he's playing around a little bit more with the type of things that he can do while still maintaining that very Shu tone of voice.
弱き調べよ麗しの恐れを手放す無防備な夢に涙を拭いさて運命に焼かれた熱がナイチンゲールああナイチンゲール共に歌おう
So here we have another song that is kind of, once again, softer and slower, and you can hear the sort of things that he's doing that we've talked about in previous songs that kind of have the same style. Once again, when he goes up into a belt, they really bring the volume down on him. It's almost like they compress his voice a little bit. You can still hear how much power there is behind it, but it just doesn't have the volume that it would have if the mixing wasn't adjusted in some way. The other interesting thing with this one, especially at the beginning, is that he does inject quite a bit of vibrato, at least into the one note. And this isn't something we've heard Shu do up until this point, and he still doesn't do it very often. But like I said, sometimes when he has solo lines, he will, and he kind of does it more as time goes on, probably because when it is just him singing alone, there's no worry about his vibrato clashing with Mika's in any way. The last thing I wanted to mention with this one is that in the final example there, you can hear him, once again, his voice kind of doing a little bit of a vocal cry. And I think that's a big thing with Shu as well, is that initially, even though, like I said, his voice has always been very dramatic and there's been a lot of emotion behind it, the emotion for the most part has been emotions that come from a place of strength. Like you can hear there's a lot of what you could almost say is anger in a lot of it, just based on the very sharp, harsh way that he tends to sing when he is performing. And that certainly is a part of Shu's character, but I think as time goes on, he's willing to let kind of the softer parts of him out as well. In this one, those vocal fluctuations at the end are much more coming from a place of, I would say, it feels like a more honest emotion. And this isn't the first time it's happened. I would say Cloth Waltz is probably the big one, and we haven't talked about that yet because it's a solo, but I think it's important to note that Shu, at this point, isn't afraid to bring other emotions into his singing that don't necessarily have to feel like he's being strong and deliberate all the time, but he can allow himself to feel whatever he's feeling. And I think that also fits with his character really well, so I'm glad that it's showing up in his singing as well. I remember when this song first came out, there were a lot of people that didn't like it because they thought it sounded too electronic to be Valkyrie, and I kind of get where that idea comes from, at least in the sense that there's kind of this like drum machine going in the background. But the rest of the music still has so many elements that classify it as a Valkyrie song. There's this rapid piano ornamentation that goes through almost the entire piece. There's these bells in the background. The melody is still very, very Valkyrie. So I think, considering that this was a Mika feature, the idea of kind of blending more modern musical techniques with classical music completely fits his character, and I actually really like this song. So I think Valkyrie's music in general is a good showcase of how music can evolve through a series but still kind of keep the essence and the heart that it always had. In terms of vocal work, there's not much here that we haven't heard before, but you get another example of Shu holding a really long sustained note with very minimal vibrato. You get another example of him actually incorporating vibrato into his singing, particularly in the bridge section where the music almost entirely fades out and you just kind of have these essentially sound effects in the background that are underneath the voices, so you can really hear what he's doing vocally. So the one thing I was looking at earlier when it comes to Le Tantifle, and I apologize, my French should be better than that, but I haven't had to take a mandatory French class in about 20 years, so that's the best I can do at this point. But the one thing I was looking at was trying to see what people thought the meter change was in this, because it does have a meter change, and just like previous meter changes we've spoken about in Honey Milk and Blackout Seesaw, most people seem to think that it's going from 4/4 to 3/4, which is what those other songs had done. Granted, it's a bit different because those ones changed in the pre-chorus and went back to the original time signature in the chorus, whereas this one changes for the chorus itself. But I did also see some people saying they thought it might be in either 6/8 or 12/8, and I'm not going to get into too much technical music stuff, but listening to it, I would almost say that I feel it more in 6/8, but it's interesting because the transitional period, the little harpsichord section that happens just before the singing in the chorus comes in, does sound very 3/4, and 3/4 is typically waltz tempo, so it's very much like a 1-2-3, 1-2-3, where you can hear each individual beat. Whereas when the chorus comes in, to me it sounds more like 6/8. And I'm only saying that because generally if you have something that's in 6/8 time, you don't actually count out every single beat. It's more like 2 big beats as opposed to 6 small beats. It gives it a much more flowing, almost like a pendulum feeling to it, where it's swinging back and forth. And if you listen to the emphasis where they're singing, it does sound more like groups of beats as opposed to 6 individual beats. Again, that's something that nobody could probably say for sure unless you saw the actual sheet music as written, but it's an interesting debate, and it's something that even trained musicians can never seem to agree on, but those are my thoughts on it. Again, this is not song analysis, but since it's such a prevalent part of the song, I wanted to mention it anyway. The other notable thing about this one is that I think it's the first time they really go into any sort of significant harmony, and I think people kind of associate Valkyrie with doing harmony, but they really haven't done that much of it, and it's something that wasn't there a whole lot in the beginning. They were mostly singing in unison and has kind of advanced over time. So I did put that part of it in just so you can hear their voices together, and they always sound really good when they go into harmony, so I'm glad that it's showing up more as time goes on. And once again, we get some examples of Shu using the softer part of his tone, sustaining notes more, so you can see that progression as it goes along, that he's just becoming more comfortable with these other aspects of his voice, while still maintaining the parts that make his voice so unique. And then he gets this song where he just gets to be very dramatic again. He can get super snarly in the verses. He's opening up more in the choruses than he was in some of the earlier songs. And you can probably hear just with the snippets of Mika's voice that come in now and again that they are doing a lot more overlapping than they were at the beginning. In some of the earlier songs, they had really short lines that kind of butted up against each other, but now they're actually singing things at the same time, where one line is kind of sustained over it and then the other line comes in underneath. And they do that a lot in the last few songs that they've recorded. And this one again has a lot of Shu playing around with dynamics. There's a lot of lines where you can actually hear the volume fluctuating as he sings through the line itself, which, as we've spoken about before, is really not that easy to do. And he does it so frequently it just sounds effortless when he goes into it, because it's not just the crescendoing or the getting louder on longer notes, it's getting louder and softer as he's singing, which again takes a lot of breath control, so really impressive whenever he happens to pull it out.
波が消え去る前に永遠の欲望なる神秘の袖に触れて空を流れる星の調べを永遠という渇きがまらぬ未来にさえも飛ぶのだ
And oh boy, then there's this song, which sounded impressive enough when they released the MV and the music video for it, and then the actual version came out and it was 6.5 minutes long, which honestly is so Valkyrie. I was not expecting them to just literally go into Clair de Lune in the middle, but I'm always a big fan of incorporating classical music into modern music, so I really liked that it happened. There are so many parts to this song that the only way I'd be able to speak about it properly is to do a full analysis, but to just talk about Shu singing, he gets to be dramatic again. There is a lot of harmony, and you can hear in the harmony sections that I put in here, he is always the one supporting Mika. So whenever I see these comments about how Shu is always like overpowering Mika's voice, or Mika's the one supporting him, which does happen, obviously, but it doesn't just go one way, and I think it's really important to at least acknowledge that. And in the middle of the song, when it gets softer and slower, he actually goes into, I would say this is kind of the first time that you could definitively call it head voice. And we haven't necessarily talked about his tone in terms of it being like nasal or aspirate or anything like that, because I would say that Shu's tone kind of fits in the middle. Depending on how he's singing, it can kind of lean either way, but when he is singing without adding any of that affectation onto it, his tone is very pure. And you can hear that especially in that section. So if anything, as we go forward into new Valkyrie songs, that's kind of what I want to hear more of from him, because we know he can do so many things with his voice, but just hearing him sing in a really clean tone is really refreshing. So I hope that happens more in the future. I have always really liked Sajo no Rokak. It makes me feel a lot of things, I would say, especially for the earlier songs. It's at least until Cloth Waltz is kind of the example of Shu actually bringing forth some of those other emotions into his singing. And he doesn't actually get to sing with Nazuna like in a duet in this one. He does in the next one, so we'll talk about it then. But the biggest thing that always struck me about this song, other than the fact that I think it's just really well put together, is I remember when it came out, there was an interview that they did with Nazuna's voice actor where he said that they had basically asked him if he wanted to go up the octave in the chorus, or whether they would do kind of like a background singer effect on it to mimic the idea that Nazuna was supposed to have, like this really high, pure voice. And he said he would do it himself, and he did. So I'm always very impressed whenever I hear these ex-Valk songs, because that is him doing that really high, it's 1 octave higher than Shu and Mika are singing, so it's very impressive. But yeah, this is one of those songs that every time I listen to it, I still feel a lot of things. So it is still, I would say it's still one of my favorite Valkyrie songs. Not necessarily for happy reasons, but just because I think it reflects that period in their lives and their story really well. And I'm glad that it was actually released kind of at the beginning. So I feel like it hit harder at that point, coming out very soon after Marionette as a story dropped. So he actually does get to sing with Nazuna in this one, and because their voices are so different, especially with the way that Nazuna is singing in these ex-Valkyrie songs, they sound good together, and I'm glad they get at least one line together in all of this. The one interesting thing with Seishon and Yugi is that I would say it has more vocal effects than a lot of the other Valkyrie songs. Typically, like I've said, sometimes the mixing will play around with things like volume and kind of vocal compression and like little things like that. But this one, there is actually audible effects onto their singing. There's like this reverb echo thing that happens at the one point. And I think in this case, it does suit the song. They don't overuse it. And I think given that this was done, 5 or 6 years ago, it's clear that this is not a pattern that they're putting into Valkyrie's music. But used sparingly, I think it can enhance the feeling of a song, and I feel like that's what it does here. So that takes us to the end of all of the Valkyrie and ex-Valkyrie music, so now we'll look at everything else that Chu's in. So we've talked a little bit in the other videos I've done on other Eccentrics members already on how their voices blend with Shu's, and it's kind of more of the same in this case, where you can still definitely hear him regardless of who he's singing with, but even though he has a very distinct tone, his bass voice is deep enough that it's very easy to blend with almost everyone else. And within the Eccentrics, obviously, we've got a lot of character voices, but he doesn't sound out of place or like he's clashing with any of the other vocalists when they're singing in duets. The biggest thing I've noticed with this one is that Shu's overall tone is so much softer than it is in most Valkyrie songs, even though there is still a little bit of him cutting the words short and kind of using those same techniques. It does sound like he's raising his larynx a little bit just because the general feeling of his tone is a little bit softer and a little bit higher, even though he's not necessarily singing any higher than usual. And I think that makes a lot of sense based on who he's singing with and kind of what the song as a whole means, because these are people that he doesn't have to put on a show for. He doesn't have to put on any sort of persona. He can just kind of be himself. And I think it's really interesting that vocally it does reflect that, and it's kind of the idea of if Shu pulled back a little bit, which of course he would never do with Valkyrie because he's too committed to the performance, but if he ever did, it's a nice look at what he would sound like in that setting. And again, kind of more of the same in Twilight Pentagram, although Twilight Pentagram is really the first time we've heard Shu singing in any sort of song that has kind of jazz or swing influences. There is a tiny, tiny bit in kind of the middle sections of Valkyrie's latest song, but it's surrounded by so much else that it's hard to kind of focus on it, and I think his voice suits it fairly well. There's one part in the middle of the song in the bridge where he has a solo line, and the backing music sounds basically like a Valkyrie track, and then it goes right back to being swing. So I always found that kind of funny that he gets his little feature with the Valkyrie music. Other than that, there's a couple lines where he's singing more dramatic again, but it doesn't feel as serious as it always does in Valkyrie songs. Again, you can tell that he is having fun. And there are a lot of reasons that I appreciate these eccentric songs exist, but in Shu's case, that's definitely one of them. Artistic Partisan is basically Shu at his most Shu, and I mentioned in the Tatsumi video how it feels a lot more like a Valkyrie song than an Alkaloid song, at least up until that point in Alkaloid's discography. He gets to sing with 3 of them, which is nice, and his voice sounds good with all of them. Interestingly, he doesn't get to sing with Mayoi, and I feel like Mayoi's voice is the most similar to his, and I feel like Mayoi actually started singing more like Shu after Artistic Partisan, which I'll probably talk about more in the relevant video, but the first Alkaloid song that came out after this one was Believe for Leaves, and a lot of Mayoi's vocals in that are very reminiscent of things that Shu does. So I would kind of like to hear them singing together, but I think if they were both going full tilt, it would probably be a little much, so maybe that's why they don't get an actual duet, but I think they could both tone it down enough to make it work for a line or two. So this one is interesting because there aren't actually any duets in it. They sing as units, but it's either solo lines or full unit lines, which is kind of disappointing because I would like to hear him, especially to hear him sing with Kuro, given the history that they have. It'd be nice for them to sing together at least once. Musically, this one, there are some of the minor chords and the stylings that are very reminiscent of Valkyrie songs, but there's also more of a Japanese influence. And again, you can hear that his voice is versatile enough to kind of fit a lot of different styles of music, even though obviously it is extremely well suited to what Valkyrie does. But he can definitely handle other styles of music, so I'm glad as time has gone on, they're giving them shuffle units and other songs where basically they're not stuck in doing the same genre over and over all the time. They're allowed to expand a little bit. Again, we get a little bit of him talking at the end. Much different speaking voice than he was using in Eternal Weaving. And once again, a very different style of song. This is like cafe music, essentially. And you can hear kind of like an Eccentric Party Night, but maybe even more so how soft his tone is. And even when he's singing with Koga and with Tsumugi and with Yuta, he's not kind of pushing his voice through the way he does with some of the duets and some of the other songs. And evidently this isn't a Shu that we're going to get to hear very often, but it is nice to hear his voice in this kind of a setting and to be able to see how he can adapt depending on the style of music that he's singing. So compared to Rei, and especially Tsukasa, he doesn't actually get that much in Endless Vide. But like I talked about in the Tsukasa video, Endless Vide is like all of them singing the lowest that they can go. And once again, the style of the music lends to a more dramatic way of singing, but he's singing with characters that have fairly deep voices, which again isn't something he's gotten to do a whole lot of before. So it's really nice to hear him singing with characters where his voice isn't necessarily the deeper one, but is actually kind of taking the higher end of things, especially with Rina and Hokuto. And Tsukasa is also singing lower than he normally does, and their voices actually sound really nice together. So he didn't get to sing with Tsukasa in Heartache Cafeteria. I'm glad that it happens here at least. I've referenced Cloth Waltz before a couple of times, but coming to it now, I think it's even more obvious that you can hear how, at least until this point in the series, this was most certainly the softest that Shu had ever been in a song. And Cloth Waltz, I think, has always been one of my favorite solos of the first group. Might still be one of my favorite solos. There's just so much feeling behind it. And I think both of Shu's solos do a very good job lyrically of kind of showing where he is at different points throughout the story. But there's something about how honest and vulnerable Cloth Waltz is that it always makes me feel things when I listen to it. And I've played it on the piano many times because I just really like the melody and the chord progression. And it wasn't something we'd really heard from him before, but again, we kind of have those moments where he's holding these really long sustained notes. He's not really going into head voice, but they're pulling back the volume on him again. So they still sound like they have power, but they're not overbearing. And it is a waltz. I haven't talked a lot about the different meters that Valkyrie songs are in because they definitely aren't all in 4/4. The only time I really mentioned it was in Le Temps de Fleur, where I briefly touched upon 3/4 being a traditional waltz meter, and here we have a song with waltz in the title that is in 3/4. So it sounds like a dance, it's supposed to sound like a dance, and I think that also adds to how different it sounds from a lot of the other solos, because for the most part they are all kind of in 4/4, and this one I'm glad they gave Shu something different to work with. 生というその空白の奏でる音を我が身に僕らが与えられしもの力あふれる美しい瞬間それを愛と呼ぼう美しき光 This solo has definitely grown on me the more times that I've listened to it. The faster tempo once again allows him to add a little bit more drama to his voice, but the one interesting thing with this one that he really doesn't tend to do that often is in the first part of the chorus, he is singing with open vowels. He's singing very, unlike before where I talked about where he's always kind of manipulating how his vowels sound, this is like just a clear open sound, and that's not something we've really heard from him before in Valkyrie songs or in other songs. And then after that he kind of goes back to how he usually sings, but once again with Shu, I find it very interesting how we get these snippets of different singing styles that he'll throw in occasionally, which proves to me that he can definitely do it, and that they're allowing him to kind of step outside of what they originally decided Shu voice is, which always comes back because I think at this point it's pretty iconic, and it's hard to imagine a true Valkyrie song without it, but it's very nice to hear that he's starting to branch out a little bit, depending on either the style of the song or even just being allowed to show off more what he can do with his voice. And that brings us to the end. Looking at the timer, I think I lied again at the beginning when I said this would be a shorter video. I should have known that if I was talking about Valkyrie, I would just talk forever. And I think that's what happened. But I hope you enjoyed this and that it was interesting and that for everyone that's been waiting for a Valkyrie video, it didn't disappoint. Coming up next, as I said, I think I'm going to do Himeru next, and then Nazuna, and then someone from Eden. I think I'm going to do Ibara. I've had a few people ask for him and I think his voice is really interesting. So I think I might do him first out of those. And at that point, the only multiple person unit that I haven't looked at yet is Akatsuki, which I've been avoiding for reasons that I think everyone pretty much knows what they are based on what Happy Elements did at the beginning of the year. I have had a few people ask me to do Kato. He is one of my 3A boys, so I would really like to do him, so I probably will after I finish up the other units, and then I'm not necessarily going to do these in a consistent rotation, but we'll start looking at other members of units that we've already covered. And yes, I have had people ask me to do Mama, and I will do Mama, but since it's just him, I'll probably hold off for a while and do him kind of closer to the middle of where everything is. But that being said, once again, I hope you enjoyed. Please like, comment, do all the things that the algorithm wants you to do, and I will see you next time.